one of the challenges that the Ukraine military has is that it doesn't have, it certainly hasn't been trained in this sort of complex type of warfare. And they're facing the Russians, and the Russians' approach to warfare is mass, in other words, numbers. We know that they've suffered over 500,000 casualties. The Russians have thus far. They've lost over 4,000 tanks, but they keep on piling people through. Now, NATO, even all the NATO countries don't have quite that level of manpower. We have technical sophistication. Our tanks and aircraft are more modern and more capable, but actually only when they all work together in all these elements. So that is exactly what they're doing at the moment.
Now let's talk about that big NATO exercise taking place in Lithuania. This comes as the Baltic countries look with obvious concern to the war in Ukraine and the ever-present threat that Russia presents on NATO's eastern flanks. Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a former commander of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment and former commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Let's talk about the significance of this NATO exercise. It's a big one, this, isn't it? And how common is it for exercises on this scale to be held?
Well, it's not common at all. And I think that is probably one of the problems. NATO's conventional defence deterrent. This is what this exercise is all about, and a string of other exercises over the last few months in the Baltic states. As you say, the Baltic states are much closer to the war in Europe than we are, and quite rightly, they're incredibly concerned that if Ukraine doesn't prevail, they will be next in line. And this is very much a show of force that hopefully Putin and the Kremlin will look at. And if they do progress, and NATO has got to make sure that absolutely they don't, but if they do, then NATO is up to it. And the only way to practice, the only way to make sure that you prevail in war is to practice. And this is what NATO is doing. Perhaps, a lot of people and people like me are probably saying, had they done this 2.5, 3 years ago, then Putin might not have rolled in to Ukraine with quite so much confidence. So it's a bit late, but it's a good start.
For those of us then who've spent our entire lives in civilian life, what are they practicing, and which of the NATO countries are there, or are they all there?
Well, I don't think they're all there. Britain had a very considerable contribution to some of the exercises a few months ago. But what they will be practicing is what we call combined arms manoeuvre. This is where tanks and artillery and infantry and air power fighter jets all work together so that they can have a coordinated defence. And when we look at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, one of the challenges that the Ukraine military has is that it doesn't have, it certainly hasn't been trained in this sort of complex type of warfare. And they're facing the Russians, and the Russians' approach to warfare is mass, in other words, numbers. We know that they've suffered over 500,000 casualties. The Russians have thus far. They've lost over 4,000 tanks, but they keep on piling people through. Now, NATO, even all the NATO countries don't have quite that level of manpower. We have technical sophistication. Our tanks and aircraft are more modern and more capable, but actually only when they all work together in all these elements. So that is exactly what they're doing at the moment.
And just how sorry to interrupt, but just how good are the NATO countries at working together? How good are we at it when we don't, perhaps we have different computer systems, do we, or different techniques, perhaps different sorts of equipment at different levels? How does all that come together?
Well, that is a really good point. And NATO has tried to standardize all its sort of communication systems, its ammunition, so that, but with countries like ourselves, the French and others, we tend to want to do things slightly differently. So it is an absolutely huge challenge. But the only way that you can get there is to work together. And the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, unfortunately, left us with a NATO that didn't do much training. And we look at our own defence, which has, been really whittled down to the bare minimum. It's the same in a lot of other NATO countries, but the Baltic states, and the Finns and the Swedes who've just joined NATO realise that actually the Russian threat is the biggest issue that they have at the moment. And by showing a strong hand, hopefully it will deter Russia. And it's something that we need to also understand in this country, because if the Russians go beyond Ukraine, we'll be in what's called a NATO an Article 5 situation, where NATO would be at war and where we would be at war as well, and our military force, is of no size
Well,
or level of training to do that at the moment.
it's interesting you mention that because I think today the figures have come out. The size of the British Army is now about 72,000, which is, I think, the smallest it's been for many, many years. How concerned are you about that?
Very, very concerned. It's not surprising as a military person. I think the defence of this country should be absolutely at the top of the agenda in the election. Now, I understand also for a lot of good reasons that it's not. But having said that, a country our size under our threats with only 70,000 soldiers, is absolutely the bare minimum. We know from Ukraine that a group of 70,000 soldiers would be exhausted and not in a position to fight after about 4 to 6 weeks, which is why there's a lot of talk about this second echelon of how we would do that. And in the summer, the chief of the general staff talked about a citizen army. There's a lot of talk going on at the moment about national service, etc., etc. But I think it's key. The other thing that's absolutely key at the moment is Britain and France have agreed to allow our weapons to be used against the Russians in Russia. The US hopefully are about to do the same. Now, this might well be the trigger that tips the balance in Ukraine's favor, which would mean that actually we wouldn't need an army much bigger than 70,000. But at the moment, it's all in the balance. And I think people in this country really need to realize, I know that everybody is desperately vexed by, the state of the National Health Service, the cost of living crisis, but Putin doesn't care.
No.
Putin at the moment is marching westwards, and we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, we have got, 5 weeks to go in the election campaign, but you're right to highlight the fact that the only time defence has been talked about was when Rishi Sunak announced his national service idea. And let's be honest, there was a fair amount of mockery, and it's been dismissed. I know there were plenty of people who thought it was a good idea too. Do you actually believe that defence will, at some point in the election campaign, feature front and centre, and there'll be a proper conversation about, for example, the threat from Russia?
Well, I hope there is, and it should be. Unfortunately, people in 1913 and people in the summer of 1939 were really approaching, life in the same way we are today. Now, if you had said to the majority of people in this country in the summer of 1939 that they would be fighting in Europe against a fascist tyrant for the next 6 years, they would say you were bonkers. Now, that is a possibility. Now, unlikely as it is at the moment, it is a possibility, and we need to discuss it, and we need to be prepared for it, because unfortunately, people like Hitler and Putin, these tyrants, they only recognize strength and they exploit weakness. And at the moment, we're showing weakness, and even discussing it in the election and showing how important it is will send a message to Putin that we're serious about it and we're not going to let him roll over Ukraine and roll into the Baltic states.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. That is Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who is a former commander of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment.